Not long ago, a woman came up to me and said, it never occurred to her that she had a right to equality. So I want to ask my audience here, do we have a right to equality? Is it our birthright? And it is. The Constitution says so. We, the people, give ourselves this Constitution, and that includes the right to equality. But then I thought, if that's true, why don't we practice equality every day? We've become so used to the unequal experiences going on around us that we are unable to see the harm it's causing. Perhaps we have to learn to own our equality. And that's what I want to share with you. For me, it began in the 80s. I woke up one morning to a tiny newspaper report. It said, the Supreme Court of India has reduced a jail sentence from 10 years to 5 years, imposed on a policeman for the rape of a 16-year-old. The reasons? The girl was of easy virtue and used to sexual intercourse. I was a corporate lawyer then, but even I could see the inequality of that outcome. I leapt out of bed and discovered the women's movement. And we filed a review. A review. It's when you go to the judges, the same judges, and you humbly suggest, Lordships, I think you made a mistake here. I was young and enthusiastic and oh, so naive. I really thought justice and equality were going to get served here. But then I was standing there as the only woman in that courtroom. And I began to hear people laugh about the woman's morality. And I felt myself going smaller and smaller and smaller, like Alice in Wonderland, wondering, what am I doing here? Our review was rejected. There was no mistake. A writer once said, you may think there's a light at the end of the tunnel, but it's probably an oncoming train. And that's how I felt. That day, I learned one fundamental truth about equality and justice. At the end of every law is a beneficiary. At the beginning is an attitude. Access to justice is decided by who is going to interpret that law and by what measure. So I became a legal innovator. I decided to travel the breadth of rural India and meet women across religion, across geographies, caste, color. And I wanted to ask them one simple question. What does access to justice mean to you? Across the board, the answer was the same. It means having my sense of self intact. Having my sense of self intact. What a wonderful common sense standard. But why wasn't that standard translating into access to justice for women who experience sexual harm? I have 3 thoughts on this. First, law and sex are really awkward companions. I mean, it's not something they talk a lot about in law school, and it's not a discussion you have in a law firm. And let's face it, we as a people are so uncomfortable about all things sexual, aren't we? I mean, suppose right now I ask you, imagine you're making love to your significant other. Go ahead. Now, I want you to share that experience with the neighbor sitting next to you. Will you do it? No. Why not? Because it's personal. All I asked you to do was to share a positive sexual experience. Yet why is it that we question women who are at a loss for words when they are urged to speak about a negative sexual experience? And that too, to their family, the judge, the lawyer, the doctor, the police person, the courtroom, the media, the public, over and over again. Which takes me to my second thought. It's that discomfort that continues to shape the stereotypes which define women and their experience of sexual harm. You can go to any legal system in the world, and at some level it is still engaged with that universal myth that she asked for it. It's a way of somehow making the harm seem less. Which takes me to my third point. Litigation. Did you know there are 33 million cases pending before our Indian courts today? 33 million. Imagine if you're the litigant standing at the end of that queue. What does litigation do? It takes a real life harm, converts it into legal facts, and applies legal rules. It only ever asks the question, what happened? But for the 1 in 3 women who experience sexual harm at least once in their lifetime, that's not access to justice, that's just damage control. Litigation does almost nothing to alter the status quo. Preventive law does, that's what I do. It shifts the question from what happened to what's happening. It's a proactive mindset. But our law had never done anything to prioritize preventive practices when it came to sexual harm. Until the case of Vishaka came along. In the 90s, there was this rural level change agent called B. She was engaged by the state to prevent child marriages. So she prevented the child marriage of a 1-year-old in an upper caste community. The men in that community began to harass her at a distance, words and gestures. She was a confident woman, so she complained to the local authority, who did nothing. As a result of doing nothing, B was gang raped. Women's groups, activists, myself, we all arrived on the scene. There was a national outcry. Death penalty, law reform, criminal case, protests. On one protest, I was marching with thousands of other women, walking next to B. And as we marched, I slowly became aware of this gut-wrenching wail from the middle of nowhere, piercing the air. And I turned, and it was B. B, the beacon of confidence. Before my eyes, she just crumpled to the ground in a heap of defeat. And I knew then we were making promises we just could not keep. We had to raise the bar. As much as this was a case about what those men did do, for once, it had to be a case about what the system did not do. B was a woman working in a workplace common to millions. No infrastructure, no fax, no phone, and no one to listen when she complained about the invisible harm that is embedded in the workplace culture which affects millions of women across our country. I knew something had to change. In my view, the worst adversary to the ongoing harm that women experience is the passive bystander. When we do nothing to prevent the harm, we're actually giving permission for it to escalate. So with her consent, the support of women's groups and lawyers, I went to the Supreme Court of India in a public interest litigation. Now, in a petition to a court, there's something at the end called a prayer. A prayer is usually a call for specific legal action by the court, but it's very legalese. So I want to share with you my version of our prayer according to the underlying sentiment as I experienced it. It sounded something like this. Your Lordships, once upon a time, unwelcome words, gestures, and images, and those everyday acts of invisible sexual harm were woven into the pattern of our life, but not into the fabric of our law. I recognize our mothers may have managed all of this behavior because for them that's just the way things were. But more of us go to work now, and we do so to earn a living, not to be sexually violated. So, Lordships, could you please liberate us from that archaic language which just refers to this harm as a moral misdemeanor? Give us language which makes us sit up and own it. How about sexual harassment? Sexual harassment, behavior which affects women everywhere, every day. And when our workplaces do nothing to prevent it, there is so much invisible harm that goes unnoticed to my performance, my pay, my leave, my health, my family, and most importantly, to my sense of self. So you see, Lordships, it's no longer about one person wanting to put another in jail. It's about enabling us as citizens to live our equality at work in an environment free from sexual harassment. Wouldn't that benefit us all, men and women? I pray your Lordship, raise the bar, prioritize prevention, enlarge the scope of our responsibility so that we as workplaces, educational establishments, and individuals feel obliged to prohibit it, prevent it, and redress it. And please, Lordships, could you do this in my lifetime and not wait for Parliament to take years to decide whether or not they want to make a law? Just find a way to make that law. And when you do, could you please make it user-friendly and accessible like my BlackBerry? After many judges, many hearings, volumes of research, and yes, 5 years, a judge with courage came along. The late Honorable Chief Justice J.S. Verma. He heard our prayer and he raised that bar. And we got our landmark user-friendly judge-made law, which finally gave a name to all that invisible sexual harm and said this is sexual harassment, and prioritized prevention and made us all responsible, and did it within this visionary twist, for the first time recognizing our right to be free from workplace sexual harassment is our non-negotiable fundamental right to equality. Amen, amen, amen. It was a transformative moment. It was a transformative moment in women's lives. I rushed to share the news with Bea. She was overjoyed in all that she had risked just for showing up at work. For her, Vishaka became a victory for all women. On the dark side of that spectrum, the criminal court acquitted those 5 rapists. Why? Because the judge felt an upper caste man would not stoop so low as to rape a lower caste woman. It's in appeal for 22 years. Has Vishaka worked? We have an act, but it's not about an act, it's about actions. Access to justice, our sense of self, comes down to a simple common sense idea: owning our equality. How do we do that? In my years as a legal expert on preventive law and equality compliance, I've influenced law and practice on this issue in much of South Asia. And there are 3 key elements I advocate. First, the prevention of workplace sexual harassment requires skill and legal expertise. Don't leave it to chance or mediocrity. Second, most of us are really willing to invest in preventing harm to our workplace reputation and profit. But are we willing to invest in preventing the sexual harm to those who work with us and help create that reputation and profit? It has to take equal priority. And third, people take their message from their leaders. Leadership messaging matters, so zero tolerance sexual harassment has to be the rule, not the exception. You know, not long ago, at the end of a workshop, a young man came up to me and said, ma'am, I have been that ogler and that stalker and that person who uses foul language at work. I'm like, okay. No, I want you to know. It never occurred to me that my behavior was impacting and hurting the equality of another citizen. So as one citizen to another, I want to tell you, that won't happen again. And I invite you to ask yourself one question. Do we want our daughters to continue to go to work and experience these same invisible acts of sexual harm that our mothers had to manage? And do we want our sons to be okay with that? Do we? If your answer is no, I'll invite you to please repeat after me. I do hereby pledge to own and practice equality every day, to take steps to prevent sexual harassment, to accept unconditionally that doing nothing is no longer an option, and that speaking up is. Thank you.